to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to our listeners to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion looking at the week's top headlines. After months of strict quarantine measures to slow the spread of the coronavirus, hard-hit countries like Italy and Spain are starting to slowly ease their lockdowns this week. Other nations will follow suit in the coming months, and it will be for each government to decide how and when to return to normal. But the question on everyone's mind is, will normal ever be the same? By now, we've all seen the surreal footage of empty highways and thoroughfares that would normally be packed with vehicles. Wild animals encroaching on abandoned amusement parks, and of course those captivating heat maps of the world showing emissions of pollutants and greenhouse gases at record lows. All of that, of course, could simply be a temporary salve for the world's rapidly warming climate. Once the public health threat recedes, the economy will come roaring back and it'll be business as usual. Or this could be the beginning of a new normal, a transition point where we finally start to take climate change seriously. Many global leaders have argued that the economic recovery from the current recession induced by COVID-19 should be a green one. But what exactly will that take? Joining me now to discuss this is Sam Fankhauser. He's director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Sam, welcome to Trendlines.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So first, give us a sense of how exactly the coronavirus pandemic has altered the way we humans interact with the environment around us. How have our emissions changed in the past 3 months, and how do those levels compare with what climatologists say we need to do indefinitely for the next decade or so in order to avert cataclysmic climate change?
Well, the impact that we immediately measure, the heat maps that you were referring to, those are air quality measures, so measures in particular of nitrogen oxide concentrations, and they have really dropped in a very striking way. We can work back from those NOx concentrations to the level of CO2 emissions because the two pollutants are usually emitted together. And if we do that, we see a drop in CO2 emissions. In China, for example, in the month of February, CO2 emissions have dropped by something like 25%, close to 25%. Now, that is one country, 1 month. So if we look at likely global emissions cuts this year in CO2, estimates say that this is something in the order of maybe 5% or so. That doesn't sound like very much, given just how much we have locked down our economy. But it's worth remembering that electricity and heat, which are some very big sources of emissions, are still being used as normal. It's just homes rather than offices that are consuming that. So 5% is the biggest drop in CO2 emissions going back a long, long time. The financial crisis of 10 years ago, for example, was more like 1 or 2% drop in emissions. So this is big. Unfortunately, if we extrapolate, if we had 5% reduction annually over the next 30 years or so, global emissions would only drop by something like 80%, which would be brilliant, actually. But really what we need to meet the Paris Agreement commitments, we need something more like net zero, close to zero emissions. And so we would need 8% annual emission reductions rather than the 5% we will have this year.
And how would that transfer to a temperature reduction in climate? And what's the target you're referring to with regard to the Paris Agreement target?
The Paris Agreement has a target of curtailing global warming to well below 2 degrees warming from pre-industrial level, with an attempt to keep it to 1.5 degrees. Currently, the sort of history of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution has already given us something close to 1 degree. So what we've already observed, we can do again, but not more than that.
Some world leaders like President Donald Trump here in the U.S. have long made clear that regardless of the coronavirus pandemic, they had no interest in addressing climate change. Trump is in the process of pulling out from the Paris Agreement, which you mentioned, for example. But for governments that do have an interest in addressing this issue, what are some of the most important ways they can incentivize a less polluting, less fossil fuel dependent economic recovery and keep those emissions at a 5% reduced level or even reduce them more?
Well, the first thing to say is that President Trump, fortunately, is now a minute minority in terms of world leaders and their attitude to climate change. Even within the United States, I would argue he's in a minority if we see what's happening at the state level. But what can committed politicians and actually business leaders and third sector leaders do? Well, we need a lot of things that have to change. If you want to structure them in an easy way, I give you three headlines. We have to change prices, we have to change technology, and we have to change behavior. In terms of prices, carbon is still not priced. The costs of emitting CO2 to society and the environment doesn't have a price in the market. And that's something we have to change. In fact, at the moment, it's the other way around. Fossil fuels are, rather than taxed, they're still being subsidized. Global fossil fuel subsidies are something like $5 trillion a year. Something like 6% of our GDP goes to subsidizing fossil fuels. So that's something that we can change quickly and easily. We can put the price on carbon, which incentivizes using polluting fuels more efficiently. That's the story on prices. The story on technology, we all know the huge progress that has been made on renewable energy. We need to broaden that into other technologies that we need. Storage of electricity in batteries, electric cars. Then we have to move on into sort of hard-to-treat sector like industries like steel and cement, where we need technologies like carbon capture and storage. We need negative emission technologies to offset the remaining emissions that we will have. So that's the technology story. A lot of research and development, a lot of technology push in clean tech. Then finally, there's the behavior aspect to it. We have to change certain behaviors that we have. Our choices of the food we eat, less meat. The choices of our travel, less flying. And that's something that we're learning the hard way and in a disruptive way through COVID-19. But our travel behavior will have to change. Our attitude to energy use will have to change. We have to use smart meters to use our energy in our homes more rationally. So behavior is a big part of what we have to do alongside technology and alongside prices.
Of those three elements you mentioned, it strikes me that the one that's easiest to change in a durable way as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is behavior. I mean, prices and technology, there were initiatives going on around those since before this crisis. But now, as you mentioned, people are flying less, traveling less, driving less. How do we incentivize people to maintain these habits even after the public health threat has receded?
That's a very good question. And one thing I would say is that the three elements I mentioned actually hang together. So prices will influence behavior, for example. It is true that it's been fascinating to see just how quickly behavior can change if people foresee a real risk and a real crisis and a real threat. So the question is some of that behavior, can it be sticky? Can it be made to be sustained in a less disruptive way? We shouldn't forget the behavior change that we are currently seeing has been very disruptive to the economy, has been very disruptive to people's welfare. So that's not the way we go about addressing climate change. We do it in a much more planned, less intrusive, less disruptive way. Still, if some behaviors can be made to stick, that would be a great contribution to the climate change problem. I would imagine people are discovering things like video conferencing and sort of business-related travel will probably take a while to come back, but it's quite clear there will also be a rebound. Certain behaviors will come back, and then we can use price mechanisms to remind people that perhaps those behaviors shouldn't come back to the degree that they otherwise would.
I know that here in New York, we've seen initiatives around making roadways off limits to cars, for instance, making them exclusively for the use of pedestrians and cyclists, and other cities around the world have implemented similar measures. Do you think there's hope in those kinds of maybe municipal level initiatives to set an example for the kinds of policies that we need to promote a more green recovery?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of what we have to do is actually happening at the municipal level, is happening in towns and cities. National governments provide the framework, but the actual action is done at the subnational level. And urban design is a big part of what has to change, including cities that are, less congested, have cleaner air, are easier to live in. And so moving from cars into public transport, into cycling is a big part of the story. Absolutely.
Another trend we're seeing as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is oil prices falling to record lows as a result of both plummeting demand, but also a price war among OPEC countries. Obviously, those prices will recover somewhat as demand recovers too. But how does this new landscape in the oil market affect the prospects of a green recovery?
It is actually a worrying trend, if I'm very honest. Cheaper prices are good for the economy, so they're good for the economic recovery. So economically, the low prices is probably not a bad thing, but environmentally, what that does is it creates too much of a rebound effect into polluting activities and into polluting fuels. So cheaper oil and cheaper gas means more expensive renewables, relatively speaking. It means electric cars are more expensive relative to internal combustion engine conventional cars. So the low oil price is actually dangerous in terms of the rebound effect that it will give us towards high polluting activities, which means policymakers should think whether the low oil price is an opportunity where some corrective taxes could be applied. In the United States, for example, taxation on gasoline is a lot lower than it is in Europe, and low market prices is a time when that can be corrected without consumers taking too much of a hit.
So that's where the price element of the three things you mentioned earlier comes into play.
Absolutely, yes.
In Europe, where you are, how does the discussion around economic recovery relate to previous climate initiatives like the European Green Deal that the EU Commission had announced recently? I wonder if you see governments as being prepared to build those earlier commitments into their recovery plans now amid this crisis, or is it the opposite? Are you seeing some reluctance to do so?
I think the rhetoric is right. There's a big commitment from very important, very influential thought leaders that we have to build back better, as the slogan is. The recovery has to be a zero carbon recovery. It can't be that we build up a high carbon economy again, which we then have to disrupt for climate reasons. So build in a second disruption when we deal with the climate crisis. Much easier to set up the recovery packages to be zero carbon, climate change oriented. That means a number of things. And European leaders have thought about those in different countries to different degrees. One thing that it means is the investment packages that will be lined up to reboot the economy can be and have to be zero carbon compatible investment packages. Investment in things like renewable energy, energy storage, electric car charging networks, energy efficiency in buildings, flood defenses. Those are all things that we urgently need for climate change reasons. Those are also things that make a very good economic recovery stimulus. They're targeted, they're timely, and they're transformational. So that's the expenditure side. We then should also look at the rescue packages that polluting industries like airlines get, for example. And the French, for example, have already started thinking whether those bailout packages should have conditions attached to it, conditions in terms of the carbon intensity of those sectors going forward.
I would imagine that those sectors would push back pretty heavily on those kinds of restrictions, although maybe given the dire financial straits they're in, they don't have a choice.
Well, it is a matter of timing, and that is absolutely important. I mean, at the moment, we're in the survival phase, if you will, and in the rescue phase. At the moment, it's a question of making sure that the economy doesn't collapse altogether and that important, otherwise solvent firms don't collapse altogether. And at that point, we shouldn't worry too much about the environmental conditionality. But as we move from rescue into recovery, we have to recognize that recovery has to be consistent with our long-term environmental goals. And firms, certainly in Europe, firms understand that. Airlines understand it. Certainly the electricity industry understand it. They have bought into our climate change targets. They know what they have to do. They're committed to do it. They don't find it easy. There are parts in those industries that slow it down. But the enlightened business leaders know exactly what they have to do. Some of them see business opportunities in it. So I don't think they would push back all that much once we move beyond the immediate rescue into the rebuilding.
Last week, we saw a gathering of world leaders and environment ministers who gathered in Berlin for this Petersburg Climate Dialogue, the 11th one annually. I wonder if you took encouragement from the tone that came out of that meeting.
I think the tone was good. The world leaders understand the importance of building back better. There are very few that would disagree with that building back better as a concept. The question, of course, will be when we move from the rhetoric to the actual packages that are being put on the table. And there we will have to see whether they will be compatible with net zero and climate resilience.
If you had to look into your crystal ball and see what the future looks like a year, 5 years from now, would you say it's more likely that we return to business as usual, or are you hopeful that this is going to be a true turning point?
I don't think we will return to business as usual, but we will not necessarily return to the perfect zero carbon pathway. That would be too much to hope for. But there will, first of all, the economy will be smaller than we thought half a year ago. The recovery will take probably a fair few years, and a smaller economy generally means a little bit less pressure on the environment. But what we have to do is sort of reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. I think measures like some of the behavioral adjustments that we have now had forced on us will stick, not to the degree, we're not going to stop flying to the degree that we have over the last months, but there will be less of it. I think policymakers are also committed to the other elements in my three elements that I mentioned. People are committed to technology very heavily. Businesses in particular are investing heavily into clean technology. Policymakers are starting to discover the merit of pricing mechanisms, and the COVID recovery is quite an expensive recovery fiscally. There's a lot of expenditure, a lot of money is being spent at the moment to keep the economy afloat. Sooner or later, finance ministers have to start wondering how they can balance the books again. And then measures like carbon taxes might actually be quite the rational way of doing that, because they discourage bad things like pollution rather than discourage good things like employment.
And it's a win-win, because then new revenue starts to come in that allows them to balance the books.
Absolutely. Finance ministers will probably be as attracted to the revenue of a carbon tax as to its environmental benefits.
So we've talked a little bit about the pricing element. We've talked a little bit about the behavior element. You mentioned some new initiatives that firms are implementing around the technology aspect. Tell us a little bit about those and what kind of promise you see in that regard.
Well, everybody talks about the amazing transformation of the electricity sector, the speed at which renewable energy, solar, but also wind, have fallen in costs. We're now seeing that replicated in sort of related technologies. We see the costs of battery storage coming down very, very rapidly, which in turn will push forward the date when electric vehicles are truly competitive with the internal combustion engine. I don't think that's much more than, say, 10, 12 years away. So those are the technologies that are lined up, as it were, where we can see the commercial breakthrough, or it has already happened. We now have to move to a second generation of technologies, sectors which we have found harder to treat. And that's where we go into the industrial sectors, where we have to find ways of produce low carbon steel. We have to find ways of producing low carbon cement. Carbon capture and storage is a technology that's often mentioned in this context. which hasn't sort of had the same success so far as renewables. We need much more hydrogen, and we have to build a hydrogen economy that's probably similar in its size to the current natural gas economy. So we need progress in that respect. Ultimately, we will also need negative emission technologies, because what we need in sort of the equilibrium around the middle of the century is net zero emissions. That means the residual emissions we still have to be offset by removing carbon out of the atmosphere. So we need technologies to do that. There's a very traditional tested technology called trees that do that, obviously building, reforesting, building up our forestry stock.
One of the oldest technologies, too, I would imagine.
Exactly. It's tested, it's old, it works, it doesn't have too many bad side effects. It's a beautiful technology. So we have to do more of that, but there are also more sort of technologically oriented negative emissions technologies that we have to experiment with and see whether they actually work.
You mentioned the need for a hydrogen economy. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, hydrogen is one of the fuels that we can use to decarbonize some industrial processes. We can probably also use hydrogen in some contexts to decarbonize the heating of buildings, although there are other technologies available for that. So that hydrogen economy will have to be a lot bigger. That means we have to produce hydrogen in an environmentally benign way. We have to transport that hydrogen and sort of build a network, a pipeline network for hydrogen, as well as a structure to produce hydrogen, for example, through carbon capture and storage.
And what's preventing us from doing that? Is it an expensive thing to do?
Well, it is an expensive thing to do. It's an untested thing to do, but the same was true not so long ago about offshore wind, for example, and we have really made progress in that respect. Carbon capture and storage is difficult in part because it's structurally always going to be more expensive than the alternative, because you need extra equipment to capture, store carbon that you would otherwise not have. So those technologies make sense only in conjunction with a carbon price that sort of incentivizes the clean production processes.
So we've talked a lot about things that governments and firms can do. For listeners who are wondering what they themselves can do as individuals, or perhaps as members of an organization, a nonprofit, or in their communities, for instance, what are some things that they might be able to do on a smaller level to prevent a return to business as usual and build back better?
Well, a lot of the action that is needed, as we said earlier in the interview, does happen at the local level, does happen in communities. It's the behavior changes that are driven by your behavior, my behavior. We decide where we go on holiday, how we go on holiday, whether we go by plane or some other method of transport. We decide how much meat we want to eat. We decide how warm we want to have it in our houses. We decide our consumption pattern. So that's in our control. Communities also define a lot of their immediate environment. The urban design is decided at the local level. Bicycle lanes, public transport, the design of cities. Those are decisions that usually rests with local communities, with mayors and with local parliaments. So there's a lot that actually does happen at the community level. Of course, the other thing that communities can do is keep up the political pressure to remind their politicians that zero carbon action is actually something they want and are willing to reward at the ballot box. And if they do that, then the politicians at the national level will hopefully respond.
Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Sam?
My final thought is to say that COVID-19 is a huge crisis. It's a big disruptive pandemic. We should remember that climate change is equally big and equally disruptive, probably more so. The difference is it's a much more slowly evolving crisis. We start seeing the first impacts of climate change. We can measure them, we can see them. We have more extreme events and so on. But it is evolving much more slowly than the pandemic, which is an acute health problem, and climate change is more a chronic one. But we shouldn't forget that climate change will be of similar dimensions than what we currently experience.
Sam, thanks very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Sam Fankhauser is director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.